Teachers. The topic which I'm going to present before you is entitled Relevance and the Quality of Secondary Education for Upward Mobility. As you know, in developed countries, the education and the training that children receive during their teenage years is long been recognized as crucial to development of job skills and other attributes that affect the ability to function productively as a member of society. In less developed countries, economic pressures typically force children into the workforce at a much earlier age, and consequently, fewer individuals are well enough educated to make significant contributions to the economic and the social development of their countries. Data from UNESCO and other international agencies suggest that some secondary education is becoming more widely available in some less developed countries. However, the formal education of children in countries ravaged by civil war, natural disaster, disease, or widespread economic hardship is often virtually non-existent. As a world civilization, it is not clear that any significant progress is being made towards the education of the population. Uh, I should say secondary education is informally regarded as the education children receive during their teenage years. Although the average ages of the entrance and the exit vary considerably among various nations. So the distinction between lower secondary education and upper secondary education is useful in a global context because developing countries are wide some access to lower secondary education, while upper secondary education is still beyond the national reach. Secondary education begins to expose students to the differentiated roles of science, the humanities, and the social sciences, and give them opportunities to understand their constitutional duties and rights as citizens. So it is clearly mentioned in para number 5.13 of the National Policy on Education 1986 is modified in 1992 that access to secondary education will be widened with emphasis on enrollment of girls, scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, particularly in science, commerce and the vocational streams. The secondary education is practiced in the country has some specific phases, and let me tell you these specific phases one by one. As far as secondary education is concerned, in India at present, planning is carried out at three important levels. These include national level, state level, as well as institutional level. However, under the Ramsa program, now known as Samagra Shiksha, which is a combination of the earlier SSA and the Ramsa, the district level planning for secondary education has also recently been operationalized in the country. Uh, Side by side, another important feature associated with secondary education in the country is that the secondary stage consists of grade 9 to 12. To be speak frankly, the country has more than 100,000 secondary and higher secondary schools, serving some 30 million students with the average teacher-student ratio of 1 is to 34. Uh, Third important uh, feature of secondary education in the country is that uh, public examinations are carried out at the end of grade 10 and the 12. Side by side, the majority of students exit school after grade 10, and for those who stay, schooling becomes differentiated and based on performance on the 10 grade subject examination. Student enters an upper secondary scheme for their last 2 years of schooling before university. Fourth important feature associated with secondary education in India is nothing but the emphasis given on inclusion of disadvantaged sections of the society. And the last but not the least, secondary education in India also give due emphasis on professional-based vocational training to help students attain skills for finding a vocation of his or her choosing. Now the question is why and for whom secondary education is being implemented in the country? Well, secondary education is widely believed to provide the optimum setting to prepare young people, predominantly adolescents, for healthy and productive adult lives, including participation in social, political, and economic spheres. In addition, for countries to compete in the global economy, a significant number of their citizens need a secondary education in order to acquire the specific skills and aptitudes necessary for an increasingly technology-driven marketplace. So for countries emerging from conflict or crisis, secondary education provides young people with much needed education and training and helps develop a foundation for rebuilding national unity and stability. To achieve these aims, the challenge for developing countries as well as countries emerging from conflict or crisis is to ensure that the secondary education subsector can accommodate enough students to meet these needs, ensure stability through equity of access, and provide a curriculum of sufficient length, quality, and relevance to ensure all the school leavers have the skills and aptitudes necessary for a productive and healthy life. So there is no simple formula for achieving this objective. As a matter of fact, secondary education delivers certain important functions. Uh, Secondary education, which is a link between the primary education and the university education, play a vital role in any program of education for national development. So it provides teachers for primary education, previous pupils for the universities and other institutions of higher learning. Besides this, a vast majority of students complete their education at this stage. Students who go for a higher education cannot take full advantage of the university education unless they have received sound education at the secondary stage. Hence, secondary education being the terminal point much of the highest quality. Dear friends, secondary education is so important in the context of India in many respects. So I will tell you, ever since the Constitution was adopted in 1950, the focus of educational programs has remained on elementary education, right? The constitutional commitment being free and compulsory education to all children up to the age of 14 years, entire efforts aim at achieving the goal of universal elementary education. However, despite significant progress in every sphere of elementary education, the goal to achieve universal elementary enrollment is still a far distant dream. So similarly, the situation in secondary education is also not a very augury. One was the decision of the constitution makers to make education compulsory up to the age of 14, and the second was the preeminence which higher education has enjoyed ever since the establishment of universities in the country. In consequence, secondary education did not receive the adequate attention. You see, India is emerging as the fastest growing economy in the world. And several international reviews predict that 21st century belongs to India and China as much as 20th century belongs to United States of America and the 19th century to Europe. As per the report of a CAPE Committee on Universalization of Secondary Education is published in the year 2005 by Ministry of Human Resource Development, Government of India. So such reviews also warn lots of pitfalls and the landmines on the way. The success depends largely upon human resource development, whereas Indian higher education provides a leadership manpower in various sectors of national life and economy. Secondary education has emerged as the single largest provider of working people in all spheres of national productivity is also the minimum common denominator. So at this critical juncture of Indian development, secondary education needs a fresh look on account of several reasons. Now, uh, the following importance are identified. This includes that secondary education serve as a foundation for higher education. Secondary education is, after all, the terminal stage of education. Secondary education is very essential in the information age. Secondary education meet international competition. Secondary education assure high rate of return. And last but not the least, education is compulsory up to secondary or higher secondary stage in several sectors throughout the country. Dear trainees, mind you, gender equality is one of the important concerns of secondary education. Let me explain. Increased availability of secondary education significantly impacts the demand for and the completion of girls' primary education. In fact, the education of girls in comparison with their counterparts still needs improvement through special provisions. And the side by side, it is crucial to promoting gender equality and empowering girls and women. Expansion and improvement of secondary education make way in this figure. Through effective secondary education, it is possible to bring about skill development among the youngsters. It is impossible to master the required skills. Every company or industry with employees requires perfection in particular skills and field of work unless one has not gained secondary education in his or her life. Right? This fact not only implies in case of an individual who seeks employment, but also in case of understanding the complexities of life and the issues which surround us. It creates a pool of qualified people with the knowledge and the skills to contribute significantly to economic development. It again allows individuals to expand their choice and to improve personal and work-related skills. Through secondary education, it is very much possible to help our young learners able to interface with technology. Secondary education is important because to be able to interface with the kind of technology that people need to be able to interface with today, computers and the software, for example, you need more than a primary education typically. Typically, you need at least a secondary education to become computer literate and to interface with the kind of technology that is going to allow for at least a degree of prosperity to take root. So, secondary education is very important. All education levels are important, but secondary school is so important primarily because it seems to be at that level that people are able to interface with more technology. It is secondary education which helps young learners able to understand the complex political environment. Primary education by no means can make an individual capable of choosing the right leader for their country. The citizens as a whole decide the future of India, and it is sad to say that the future of India, apart from a section of educated individuals, also depend upon the majority of illiterates and these half literates. It is only through secondary education that an individual becomes capable of understanding the complexity of politics and the political processes. This helps all of us nurture an India of our dreams, which will be listed as a developed nation instead of a developing world. Again, there is a close relationship between secondary education and the economic growth. So let me tell you how secondary education brings about economic growth in different nations of the world. You see, governments are increasingly paying attention to secondary education for many reasons. The expansion of secondary education is putting increasing pressure on the secondary school systems by their sheer number. The link between secondary education and economic growth evidence suggests that having a critical mass of people with secondary education is key to shifting the basis of economic growth from a labor intensive to a more knowledge centric activity. Global evidence shows that an additional year of secondary schooling increases future wages by about 10 to 15%. Further, raising completion rates in secondary schools by 3 percentages boosts yearly per capita growth by 1 percent point. Several benefits of investing in secondary and higher education, including the fact that it ensures sustainable economic growth and is crucial to reaching the Millennium Development Goals. Secondary education is the only solution to this major issue, converting India from a developing to a developed nation, but also increase the status of the country in the eyes of other nations. Secondary education also brings about social learning among secondary level students. Beyond economic benefits, educated women are better equipped to make decisions regarding marriage, bearing children, child health, and education. An extra year of women's education helps reduce fertility and maternal mortality by 2 per 1,000 births. It is also important for them to be ethical and moral leaders in developing countries that are well trained. So much manpower development is possible through secondary education. Secondary education plays a fundamental but complex role in preparing young people for the labor market, especially for people who leave secondary education for a job. So the complexity in such cases is that an increasing number of young people in secondary education means increasingly diverse talents, diverse job interests, and job opportunities. But an additional complexity is the shifting needs of employers, which are changing rapidly. Young people need to have the tools and the knowledge to adapt to that change. While Indian higher education provides leadership manpower in various sectors of national life and economy, secondary education has emerged as the single largest provider of working people in all spheres of national productivity as also the minimum common denominator. Well, friends, India being a land of religion, many individuals believe in unnecessary superstitions and dogmas. And the primary reason of believing these dogmas is the lack of sufficient amount of education. So secondary education practically solves the problem and helps people bring about peace and harmony among people and the promote secularism. Secondary education again helps our young learners able to develop self-confidence. The self-confidence of an individual with secondary education is immense as compared to an individual with primary education or in some cases no education at all. A person who has gained secondary education has the understanding of all the happenings in the society, country, and the world as a whole, as a result of which he or she is in a position to question any authority in general. Only an individual with secondary education can gain this amount of self-confidence in each and every walk of life. So from the foregoing discussion, we can easily find out the rationale for secondary education. So firstly, secondary education develops faculties of critical thinking, abstraction, insight, skills, and competence at a higher level. Secondly, it serves as a foundation for higher education. It provides requirement for employment and labor market quality. Secondary education is very critical to social and economic development and growth. Uh, Rates of return on secondary education are found to be very high. There is rising demand from elementary leavers. International competitiveness is there, particularly in terms of the provision of secondary education. There is gender equity in secondary education. There is requirement for primary teachers in the country, and last but not least, poverty reduction and equity is the concern of secondary education. So because of the following reasons listed here, there is need for expansion of secondary education in the country. The reasons include the success of SSA in the country, increasing demand of secondary education, lack of focus in the state in terms of provision of secondary education, marginal role of central governments towards provision of secondary education, existence of all kinds of disparities in terms of gender parity, regional disparities, spatial disparities, social disparities, then the affordability of secondary education to the masses, as well as quality concerns. So because of these reasons, there is need for expansion of secondary education in the country. So, in spite of much efforts given from the side of both central as well as state governments, secondary education in the country is exposed to a wide range of challenges to be overcome. This include learning gap, where students at secondary level lag behind on elementary level competencies. There is equity issues in access to secondary education. Girls are lag behind in boys in accessing secondary education because of the poor socioeconomic condition of the nation at large. Poor IT infrastructures are there in secondary schools across the country. There is again poor infrastructure and lack of accessibility from geographical point of view. Teacher availability and the competency is another issue associated with secondary education, and there is absence of life skills training. Uh, uh, in the concluding part of this lesson, based on the discussions made, I would like to come to the conclusion. So, in all countries, secondary education is widely recognized as instrumental, both as a cause of instability and division, and as an agent for nation building and social cohesion. If well planned and adequately resourced, secondary education has the potential to provide an environment where large numbers of adolescents can gain the skills and knowledge needed to better participate in a peaceful, democratic society, as well as develop the necessary knowledge to avoid risky behavior and lead a more healthy life. So this is also true for countries in crisis or post-conflict settings, but the nature of these countries adds unique challenges to restoring or developing an education system. So in these settings, where governments as well as education systems and structures are fragmented or decimated, A different approach to reconstruction and reforms is needed, one that responds to the urgency of rebuilding the needs of different social groups, orphans, refugees, ex-combatants, victims, the dire lack of resources in terms of teachers, buildings, curriculum materials, and the social and the political conflicts and the complexities that persist. The need for expanded, more equitable access to relevant, good quality curriculums is the key goal that currently drives debates about secondary education and emerging reform agenda in both developing countries and the settings of conflict of crisis. Unless adequate quality provisions for secondary education is made, the skyrocketing demand may destabilize the school education system, leading to frustration to the growing aspirations of the people and risking the fast growing Indian economy. So with this, let me say thank you very much.